What signs do you see that Donald Trump may fail?
Well, listen, that's going to be up to the voters to decide. I like Donald, as you know. A lot of other Republican candidates have gone out of their way to smack him with a stick. I am not one of them. I am glad he's running. I think he's brought a lot of energy and excitement to the race. You know, we've seen every one of the Republican debates. We have double the number of people watching them that the Democrats have. And I think Donald has generated a lot of that excitement. I personally am grateful because that's millions of people who may never have turned on the television who are having the opportunity to hear my positive, optimistic, conservative message. And I will say, after every debate, what we're seeing is steadily increasing momentum. What I am most encouraged about in this campaign is that we are seeing conservatives unite behind our campaign. More and more conservatives are coming together. You know, historically, there have been two major lanes in the Republican primary. There's been a moderate lane and a conservative lane. And typically there's been a consensus moderate choice early on, and all the money gets behind that candidate. And conservatives, typically there have been a ton of us, nobody has any money, and we fight like cats and dogs. This cycle, that entire dynamic is flipped. The moderate lane is unbelievably crowded. There are a whole bunch of candidates who I think are going to spend millions of dollars here in the state of New Hampshire. The folks in the media will be happy. They'll buy a ton of ads, ripping each other apart. But it's interesting. This cycle, the moderates are acting like conservatives normally. And among conservatives, you know, you look at the two candidates that have dropped out, Scott Walker, Rick Perry, both very good men, good governors. They were competing predominantly in the conservative lane. Other candidates who were expected to be formidable in that lane are not getting meaningful traction or support. And what we're seeing every day is conservatives coalescing behind our campaign. You know, one great illustration of that was the 603 Alliance. An alliance of conservative leaders, conservative activists, conservative groups across the state of New Hampshire that many months ago vowed to seriously vet every conservative in the race and to move as a bloc to get behind the strongest conservative in the race. Well, just a couple of weeks ago, the 603 Alliance held their caucus. I went and participated at a barn in rural New Hampshire. They voted and we won 72% of their vote. That's a manifestation of what we're seeing of conservatives uniting behind our campaign. And I think if that continues to happen, if conservatives continue to unite behind our campaign, we're going to win this primary. And that's also how we win the general election, is we've got to bring back to the polls the millions of conservatives who stayed home in 2008, who stayed home in 2012. We've got to bring people back with common sense conservative values, with the free market principles and constitutional liberties that built this country.
The fact is, though, that I know that you don't like to hit Mr. Trump with a stick, as others do. But
well, you guys are so good at it.
The fact is that he has 20-something percent of the vote, and a lot of those people, the conventional thinking is, would have been could possibly well have been your voters. At what point do you have to start trying to get those voters and distinguish yourself from Mr. Trump?
You know, I think
what is the distinguishing factor, too?
I think the distinguishing factor that every Republican primary voter is looking for is distinguishing between campaign conservatives, people who talk a good game on the trail but haven't walked the walk, and a consistent conservative. And I am the only candidate running who has been a consistent conservative, who's been a fiscal conservative, a social conservative, a national security conservative. And we're seeing this in the debates. That's starting to flesh out. You know, there is a season to politics. Folks in New Hampshire know this well. The year before the election, there's a lot of excitement. A lot of it's driven by name ID. A lot of it's driven by whoever's in the media that given day. As you get into November and then December and then especially January and February, voters start to get more serious. They start to pay more attention. And they start to examine the candidates. They start to learn their records. And I actually think things like the 603 Alliance are good foreshadowing of where voters end up when they start to learn the comparative records of the candidates. That if you look at how primaries play out, I think the grass tops activists are early foreshadowing of where the voters will be, because they are the folks who now have put in the time to do the hard scrutiny to say, all right, who's telling the truth and who's just on the campaign trail saying whatever's popular at the moment. That's the job New Hampshire does a fabulous job of doing, and what Heidi and I are committed to doing is spending the time here in the state so people have the opportunity to look me in the eyes, I hope look every other candidate in the eyes, and take the measure of who has walked the walk, who has been a consistent conservative. You know, you look at these debates. In many ways, this Republican primary has boiled down to one simple question. Who will stand up to Washington? And just about every candidate there is saying, I'll stand up to Washington. Well, I think that's terrific. Because the natural next question that any voter asks, particularly as you're starting to research and learn about the candidates, is, okay, who actually has stood up to Washington? And in that regard, my record is markedly different from every other candidate on that stage. In terms of standing up not just to Democrats, but to leaders of our own party, standing with the American people and the Constitution. You know, you think back to 2013. In 2013, millions of Americans rose up against the disaster that is Obamacare. I was proud to lead that fight. If you look at the other very fine men and women that are standing on that Republican debate stage, the question naturally arises, where were they? They were nowhere to be found. If you go to 2014, millions of Americans rose up against President Obama's illegal executive amnesty. Once again, I was proud to lead that fight. Once again, if you look at the other very fine men and women on that debate stage and you ask the question, where were they? They were nowhere to be found. But you know, you don't have to go back to 2013 or 2014. You can go back just a few weeks ago. If you remember the Republican presidential debate that was in California, just about every Republican candidate looked in the TV cameras and said, we should defund Planned Parenthood. Great example of the kind of campaign conservative language, the rhetoric candidates use. Well, just a few weeks later, we had an epic, drag-down, knockout fight in Washington on exactly that issue. Once again, millions of Americans rose up against sending taxpayer funds to Planned Parenthood. Thousands of pastors all over the country lit up the phones calling their members of Congress. And once again, I was proud to lead that fight. And if you look at the other men and women on that debate stage, you ask the question, where were they? They were nowhere to be found. It was like they were in witness protection. and that distinction, I think, explains why conservatives more and more are uniting behind our campaign. Carl.
Senator, last question. You were talking about the differences between yourself. Last night in your event at the VFW, you got a raucous bunch of applause when you talked about your opposition to amnesty.
Yep.
Can you specifically talk about how you think your candidacy is superior to the rest of the Republican field based upon that singular issue?
Well, sure. You know, if you look at the debate we just had this week, I thought it was a terrific debate. And kudos to Fox for doing a great job moderating it. What I thought was terrific is we actually got into substance. We got into substantive issues, and the questions weren't easy. They asked hard questions, but it wasn't just condescending, gratuitous insults and attacks. And we started to see some real distinctions. I think this last debate will prove helpful to Republican primary voters who are starting to get to invest more and more time seriously comparing the records of the candidates. And you know, you think about that debate. Early on in the debate, you saw candidate after candidate basically compose an epic poem to amnesty, saying how wonderful it was that they were supporting amnesty. Now, I have to admit, as I was standing there listening to it, I think I had the sentiments that millions of Americans across this country had, which is my head was exploding. And my response to that, I said, listen, if Republicans end up joining arm in arm with the Democrats in supporting amnesty so there's no difference between us, we will lose in 2016. If the Republican nominee and Hillary Clinton are both advocates of amnesty, millions of working men and women, millions of Reagan Democrats will say, to heck with all of you, you're all a bunch of corrupt Washington cronies, and I ain't showing up. And I pointed out, listen, when it comes to amnesty, you know, there's a real socioeconomic divide. You look at the elites in Washington, and their view of amnesty is they think it's great. They think illegal immigration is great. Why? It's cheap labor. The more cheap labor, the more we drive down labor prices, the better. I think that is crazy. People are hurting in this country, and it's the working men and women. At every stage in this campaign, at every stage as president, I will stand with the working men and women. I also think that's how we win the general election. is we run a populist campaign fighting for hard-working men and women who want to believe again in the promise of America. And we run that against the bipartisan corruption of Washington, which Hillary Clinton embodies. And on the question of amnesty, this is one of the issues on which there is a sharp divide in the field. A majority of the candidates standing on that Republican debate stage have previously publicly supported amnesty. And I am the only candidate standing on that debate stage who has never supported amnesty, and in fact who led the fight to defeat amnesty in Congress. When Chuck Schumer and Barack Obama joined with establishment Republicans in pushing the massive amnesty plan, the Gang of Eight bill, I joined side by side with Senator Jeff Sessions. We led the fight to defeat amnesty, and we beat it in Congress. We defeated it. And I would note that, there are a lot of Republican politicians who frankly are listening to the elites, who believe it is really compassionate to support amnesty. There is nothing compassionate about a politician saying, I'm so compassionate, I'm going to give away your job. It's very easy for them to say, none of them are going to lose their jobs. But say it to the truck driver. Say it to the steel worker. Say it to the carpenter. Say it to the hardworking men and women. We have the lowest percentage of Americans working today of any year since 1977. Median wages have stagnated for 20 years. And a big part of the reason is what I call the Washington cartel. Career politicians in both parties, they get in bed with lobbyists and special interests, and they grow and grow and grow government. They all support, the Washington cartel supports amnesty because it's good for big government and good for big business. It's bad for the working men and women of this country. There's a reason 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America are in and around Washington, D.C. And how do we win in November? It's very simple. If I'm the Republican nominee, I cannot wait to stand on that debate stage with Hillary Clinton to make very clear that the Obama-Clinton economic policy has been an absolute disaster. The rich have gotten richer. Today, the top 1% earn a higher share of our income than any year since 1928. And the people who have been hurt have been young people, have been Hispanics, have been African Americans, have been single moms. Income inequality, which Secretary Clinton loves to talk about, has increased dramatically under her failed big government policies. But the way we win also is to draw a contrast, to make very clear to the voters. If you vote for Hillary Clinton, 12 million people who are here illegally will get amnesty. And if you vote for me, they will not. Likewise, if you vote for Hillary Clinton, Iran, led by a theocratic Ayatollah who chants death to America, Iran will get nuclear weapons. If you vote for me, Iran will not get nuclear weapons. That's how we win. Like Reagan said in 1980, paint in bold colors, not pale pastels. And if the Republican Party nominates a candidate who supports amnesty along with Hillary Clinton, we will lose the general election.
Thanks, guys. Senator was speaking outside.
If you feel like it's more important to stake out the most distinct position from Hillary Clinton than it necessarily is that amnesty is 100% the best thing for the country. Is one more important than the other?
I recognize that in the media it's always about the horse race. But that's not the way most people think. I am someone who's spent his entire life.
Well, this doesn't have anything to do with the horse race. I'm just
Well, but it does. Look, I've spent my entire life fighting to defend the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. In the Senate, what I have tried to do every day is 2 things. Number 1, tell the truth. And number 2, do what I said I would do. I'll tell you one of the amazing things we're seeing as I travel the country. Every day people come up to me who are Democrats who say, I don't agree with you on everything, but I'm voting for you because I can trust you. I know where you stand. You're not just putting your finger in the air and seeing which way the wind is blowing. And on the issues that I agree with, I trust that you're really, really there, that when you say you support something, you really support it. It's not just a Washington, I'm with you as long as it's popular, but if it ever turns, I'm going to abandon you as quick as can be. And when you're against something, you're really, really against it. People are tired of the mendacity. They're tired of politicians who campaign on one issue and then do exactly the opposite. You know, I wrote a book this summer called A Time for Truth. The opening chapter of that book is entitled Mendacity. It describes the debt ceiling. It describes how Republican leadership asked every Republican to affirmatively consent to lower the threshold and make it easier for Harry Reid and Barack Obama to add trillions in debt. And Republican leadership told us the reason we should do so is then the Democrats would have the votes to do it on their own. And so we could come back to our constituents, we could vote no, and tell them we opposed the thing we had just consented to allow happen. That's the mendacity that the people are fed up with. I objected to that, earning a great deal of wrath and ire from my colleagues. And I think people are tired of politicians who don't tell the truth. Let me make a final point, just wrapping up. Which is, this morning I just filed to be on the ballot here in the state of New Hampshire. It is fantastic to be in New Hampshire, and let me in particular say how important New Hampshire's first in the nation status. You know, there are voices in Washington that are arguing for getting rid of New Hampshire's first in the nation status. I think that is absolute lunacy. And the reason is simple. The men and women of New Hampshire take very, very seriously the responsibility of vetting the candidates. If presidential races began in big states, whether New York or California or my home state of Texas, it would all be a bunch of slick TV ads produced in Hollywood. And it would basically boil down to whoever throws the most money at it buys the race. The great virtue of New Hampshire, you can't win the state of New Hampshire just by dumping money on it. If you want to compete in New Hampshire, you come here and you roll up your sleeves and you sit down in a diner, you sit down in a living room, you sit down in a barn, all of which I've been in the past few weeks in New Hampshire. And you answer questions. You answer tough questions over and over again. And the enormous value that the men and women of New Hampshire provide is you look every candidate in the eye and you take the measure of the man or the woman. You take the measure of, are they telling me the truth? Is this just some more campaign talking points that some staffer's given them because it polls well today, and tomorrow they'll do the exact opposite? Or is this someone that is speaking from conviction? Is this someone that I can trust? Is this someone who has actually walked the walk? That's the role of the men and women of New Hampshire, is to take that measure. And I will say, every one of you, millions of Americans, is counting on you to vet the candidates in a way they will never get the opportunity to do. Most Texans will never have the opportunity to do what men and women of New Hampshire have to do, which is look presidential candidates in the eyes, ask them the hard questions, and measure their response. I think New Hampshire is critical in the process, and I'm thrilled, I'm deeply honored to be on the ballot. I will say my wife Heidi is here. Heidi and I and our girls, Caroline and Catherine, we spent a lot of time here in New Hampshire. In fact, just a few weeks ago, we took the girls to a petting zoo. They had, I have to admit, they thought the petting zoo was much more fun than town halls and political rallies. But they got to ride a pony and pet a bunch of animals and then go apple picking here in New Hampshire. And we are thrilled to be here, and we're going to work very hard to earn the votes of every man and woman in this great state.
Senator,
Thank you.
we got to go walk. Senator will be outside speaking more, so we'll be out front.
Taking questions?
Croc TV.